So good evening and welcome to everybody. My name is Jacqueline Philpott and I am the Executive Director of AFCI. It's actually midnight here in Los Angeles, so we do wish you a welcome from all over the world this evening, and we appreciate you taking the time to be on this call from London to New Zealand to Australia to Durban to Dublin to Bali and more. We really do have a great mix of attendees that have signed up for this call today. So the following report presentation is an update to the original 2019 collaboration between AFCI and Olsberg SPI, adding 3 new areas of research which the team will discuss shortly with you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the team at Olsberg for undertaking the significant update to the report, and to Netflix, of course, too, for their support. Without this collaboration, it would not be possible to bring you this today. Before I hand it over to Kaylee from Olsberg, a couple of housekeeping items for you all. This is being recorded, so it can be made available to watch later in the week. You might want to let colleagues know how it went or update them to head online to the AFCI website to see this after the fact. You are also more than welcome to ask questions in the chat. You can either use your name or you can do that anonymously. We'll keep an eye on those, but we'll also give you an opportunity at the end to ask questions as well. And lastly, if you have any further queries after the call, you can reach out to any of us directly, and I'll be putting our contact details in the chat for you too. So let's get this show on the road. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I'll hand over to you, Kaylee from Olsberg SPI.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And hi, everyone. I will just get the presentation up. We can start. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to be here with you all today to present the key findings from our best practice in screen sector development study. We're going to be running through a few different things today. We'll begin with a bit of information about the study, both in terms of the content we're covering and some details about the different reports, publications that we have. And then we will also be looking at some context, some background, industry, data, and content that's relevant to the industry and the trends that we've been seeing. A short little bit about the best practice in terms of methodology, and then finally the key findings. So looking at the 7 research areas that make up the different chapters of the full report. So to begin with, just to reiterate some of the points that Jacqueline already mentioned, this is a follow-up study from one that we first did in 2019 with AFCI, which looked at 4 key areas, which was production incentives, workforce capacity, infrastructure, and film friendliness. For the 2024 edition of the report, we expanded this to also look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, sustainability, and partner engagement. And we'll go through all 7 of those areas later in the presentation. The report has been fully updated and expanded, and it's a really useful document to highlight the various policies, interventions, initiatives, and strategies that both drive sustainable growth in the film, television, and documentary sector, which we'll be referring to as screen from now on, but also that helps to kickstart the industries for those areas that are maybe more emerging. And this report was produced in partnership with AFCI, and we received financial support from Netflix. So thank you to Netflix for their support producing this. So just very quickly, there are two main reports that we've published as part of this. The first is the full report, which is just under 120 pages, that includes a really comprehensive analysis of each of those 7 research areas, including some of the key findings that you'll be seeing today, key considerations and background, examples of ineffective practices that everyone should be aware of, and then also 19 case studies from across the globe to exemplify some key examples of best practice in various markets. And then to complement this, we also produced a key findings summary report. So this is a shorter 60-page document that summarizes a lot of the key areas from that full report. But most importantly, this report's been published in 11 languages. So Arabic, Bahasa Indonesian, English, French, Korean, Japanese, Malay, Mandarin, Portuguese, Spanish, and Thai. At the end of this presentation, I have a QR code if anyone wants to scan to download the reports. Otherwise, you can also go to the AFCI website or the Olsberg SBI website to receive those links. So I'll pass across to Leon to discuss some of the context and background.
Great, thanks, Kaylee, and hello everyone, and thanks, Jacqueline, for AFCI's collaboration on this study. I'm just going to talk briefly about some context. As Kaylee mentioned, this is a sort of revisiting and a full updating of a study we did with AFCI in 2019. And one of the key reasons we decided to revisit this work is the shift in context between 2019 and 2024. And as everyone on this call will be aware, over that period we've seen a huge increase in global production, particularly in the scripted series space, which you can see on the chart on the right, which is data you likely be familiar with from FX networks. But really over that time, we've seen a huge increase in production on a global scale, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 sort of pandemic era, when there's a very rapid return to production in response to demand. Obviously, we're now seeing significant sort of headwinds for the sector, both with factors both outside the sector, things like inflation, cost inflation, and challenges within the sector, thinking particularly of the strikes and coming out of that period. So looking sort of to the future and what that means, what that context means, you'll see some data on the next slide, which is looking at, this is some Ampere data actually, but looking at content spend by region forecast to 2028. And while we're seeing definite challenges in established markets like North America and Western Europe, there is still growth to be had in certain regions of the world, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, Central South America, the APAC region, and Central and Eastern Europe. So, definite headwinds for content spend, but definite opportunities for growth in some parts of the world. And just looking specifically at the Asia Pacific region on the next slide, and the growth in incentives that we've seen in that region. As you'll see from the data on screen, in 2017, there were around 7 incentive systems or automatic incentive systems in the APAC region. And by this year, that had round about doubled to 15. And we're seeing over that time some key, some key producing countries coming on stream with offers for international production, thinking particularly of Japan, which introduced its location incentive in 2023 following a pilot system, and certain increases. Australia's announced the increase of its location offset, obviously. And there's, on the next slide, there's a map just showing the provision in the Asia Pacific region as well. The blue are larger incentives that are typically uncapped, and the red territories are incentive systems where there are caps in place. So, this has been a very active region and continues to be a very active region as, as governments and legislators look to develop the value of this sector. And we have some case studies we have quite a large number of case studies in the report, including for APAC territories, and we'll return to some of those later in this session, including South Korea. Kaylee.
Thanks, Leon. So just a little bit of background, additional background about the study. So as I mentioned, we're looking at 7 research areas for this study, which builds on the 2019 study that had the 4. These are all interrelated areas that also operate independently, but are critical for sectoral development. And a really cohesive ecosystem will be a jurisdiction that delivers across all 7 of these areas. However, of course, it's important to note that it's not a one-size-fits-all. So the levers in terms of how these are arranged for each jurisdiction will vary slightly in terms of which maybe are most important at certain points in their development, but all are critical for making sure that a jurisdiction is delivering a really strong offer. And then one thing that we don't go into in this presentation, but is in the full report, is around ineffective practice. So these are areas within this, or initiatives or blockages within these 7 areas that limit the ability to attract production, whether that's international or local and domestic, and hamper efforts to develop the screen sector. And within the report, we also look at both formal and informal interventions. So formal interventions are things like legislation, whether that's around incentives or workforce, or other legislation that may be relevant to the screen sector. It can also be strategies or guidelines. And informal interventions are the various procedures and processes that are in place to help those formal interventions operate on the ground. And the 2 areas work together in order to create a sector that's really responsive to the changing sectoral needs, that are making sure that a jurisdiction is relevant to both domestic and international production needs, which overlaps but can vary, that will ensure that it's closely informed by producer needs and what those needs are throughout production, and that's relevant at the national or regional level, or in the case of any states or provinces or regions, that might be at the state and province level, and then at the city or town level. And then both formal and informal interventions should be regularly reviewed for effectiveness and relevance. And as Leon mentioned, we have quite a number of case studies throughout the report. In this presentation, we have 3 or 4 APAC examples to walk through with you, but this is just to give you a larger look at the different case studies that we have across the different research areas. In terms of how we selected these case studies, this was a combined process of a huge amount of research looking at standout examples of programs or initiatives or film offices or organizations that were doing really good work within these different areas. And then we complemented that with a huge number of consultations and discussions, both with people in the industry on the sort of film office and film commission side, as well as producers, line producers, and other industry folk who could tell us from their experience where they found the best examples of interventions in these areas. And then we produced the case studies, which look at not only what the intervention is, but some of the impact around it and some lessons that can be learned from each of these case studies. And of course, these are just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other case study examples that could have been included, and these were the final ones that we produced. So
Thanks, Kaylee.
Pass back. Thanks, Leon.
So to run through these 7 research areas of best practice, and as Kaylee mentioned, the full report goes into a great deal of detail on each of these findings. So I'll run through them on a very high level now, but do encourage you to look at the report. So the first area is production incentives, obviously a very key policy intervention in our sector. There's now getting up to almost 120 automatic incentives at state, province, or country level globally. And I mentioned the production cost inflation that we've been seeing. And that, combined with the high financial risk involved in production, means that incentives, are very key interventions for the sector, and producers are obviously very, very sensitive to the offer of incentives and the role that the incentive can play in reducing that cost and reducing that risk. So I think in our view, these can be, a well-structured incentive can be a very flexible incentive model. And I think one of the trends we've seen since the 2019 publication is the increased use of incentives by lawmakers or policymakers to try and hit different sort of strategic goals for their jurisdiction. And I think with that in mind, one thing to underline is the use of incentives for both domestic and inward productions. And in our work, we generally never advise a focus on inward over domestic. I think both parts of a production ecosystem are critically important, and for a sort of healthy, sustainable sector, we need a healthy domestic production sector and ideally a healthy sort of inward sector as well. So thinking about incentive design, it has to work for the reality of domestic producers in the jurisdiction. And often that's about making sure it can provide, investment for projects when market funding might not be able to cover that full project. I think for both types of productions, that reduction of uncertainty is a key element of incentive administration and incentive attraction. So, if we think about the role of an incentive in reducing cost and reducing risk, then, it has to be certain, it has to be a stable system that producers know is going to work for them. I think another key point is about process speed, and particularly for independent projects, the cost of borrowing, the cost of money has increased very much, and in many territories. And I think, we're seeing a lot more sensitivity around how long incentive systems take to deliver. And, if a producer is waiting multiple years for payout, then that's obviously far from ideal for them. Excuse me. So it becomes around, there's a competitive element around the speed of a system. Budgets and caps, we're not, many countries are not able to offer an uncapped incentive investment. But what we definitely see some best practice around the management of those caps and the way in which incentives can be structured to get the most benefit of production for that jurisdiction, even when there's a cap in place. Regarding targeted uplifts, I mentioned we're seeing much more usage of incentives to try and hit particular strategic goals. And an obvious way of doing that is through an uplift. Whether that's trying to stimulate regional activity or trying to stimulate, particular types of hiring. We're seeing many systems implementing these sort of uplifts. I think best practice is making sure the strategic goal is clear and that it's attainable for productions to meet. So making sure, for example, if there's a regional filming uplift, that uplift is tied to the ability to find infrastructure or crews in those places, or help facilitate the movement of crews to those regional sort of filming spots that the incentive is trying to stimulate. And then I think finally, consideration of effective value. I think, given the increase in incentives, producers and studios are very much more focused on how an incentive will sort of net out for their spend at the end of the process. And, we've seen some examples of incentives being marketed quite aggressively in terms of their headline rate, but in actual fact, that headline rate might not bear a huge amount of resemblance to what is actually received by the producer at the end. And I think, again, best practice is about clarity, it's about transparency, and it's about being realistic about what the incentive is going to deliver, and on the administrator side, not over promising in a way that might end up with a disappointing result for the production. Moving on to the second area, which is workforce capacity. As everyone on this call will be aware, this is, in terms of the production growth that we've been talking about, this has been a real pinch point for many industries across the world, and we're obviously now in a slightly different place, but it remains a really key area. And one of the large significant selling points of the screen production sector is its ability to create jobs, to create high skilled jobs. So this is a key focus for policymakers in our sector. And I think the key finding in best practice terms is that targeting workforce interventions is completely critical. Kaylee mentioned there's consideration of ineffective practice, and I think we've seen a number of examples of workforce strategies that don't align with what the industry needs, and they don't produce workers who are ready to go on set and work on production. So I think that's it's a slightly obvious point, but it's a key one. Workforce capacity interventions have to align with what the industry needs. And I think a key part in that that's often missing is data, and for jurisdictions to be able to look at their screen workforce and understand precisely where the strategic gaps are in that workforce and how to quickly solve those gaps, fix those gaps to to get the industry really delivering. I think another element to that is not just focusing on new entrants. I think a lot of workforce strategy focuses on getting people into the sector, which is obviously needed, but we're also seeing a move towards bringing people sideways into the sector. So workers with, mid or high levels of transferable skills coming across to the sector and being able to work at a higher level than a new entrant. And that leads us to a point about cohesive strategies. Just as targeted strategies are critical, it's also critical that these strategies are cohesive across the piece and considering sort of all elements of the workforce, including, as I say, bringing people in from across the workforce and from other sectors of the economy. Moving on to the third area, this is infrastructure. Obviously, alongside workforce, a key pinch point in many markets. I think we do a lot of work in this area as we do all 7 of these areas, and I think the infrastructure question is often raised as on its own. I think for a jurisdiction, sometimes they can look to a studio solution as a way of getting the industry moving, whereas in fact it should be considered very much in concert with the development of the other key areas that we're talking about today. So not thinking about studio development in isolation, but thinking about it in terms of alignment with the incentive offer, the workforce offer, and so on. And that it becomes about timing, making sure that investment in infrastructure is being undertaken at the right time so that the use case has been proven and there is evidence that the industry is up and running and is able and needs the studio, but is also able to fill it. And I think we're seeing successful use of pop-up or sort of converted infrastructure. So I think it's often, a purpose-built studio often isn't necessarily required, and there can be other ways of developing the sector through infrastructure. And that's been used very successfully in a number of markets. I think for the public sector or for public sector investors, there's often a role that can be played that isn't just about providing financial support. And we do, of course, see public organizations investing in screen production infrastructure, but there are often more strategic ways that their resource can be used. And that's about things like, helping find land for commercial investors or helping to flag the opportunity for commercial investors. and paving the way for commercial investors to develop infrastructure. And then finally, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but the sustainability element, that's a cross-cutting theme across all 7 of these areas, but definitely making sure, as with other areas, that sustainability is a consideration right from the start, from inception of a studio idea or a studio plan, making sure that sustainability is very much front and center there. Kaylee, I'll hand to you to talk about Queensland, if I may.
Thanks, Leon. So this is the first of our case studies today, and this is on infrastructure and looking at Queensland, Australia, and specifically the Screen Queensland studios in Cairns, in far north Queensland, and Brisbane. So Queensland is very much an established production centre and has been growing substantially over the last few years, and has a number of private and publicly owned or public-private studios in the state, although they typically are centred down south in southeast Queensland. Earlier this year, a new studio was opened in far north Queensland in Cairns, and that is able to support location-driven production that may be occurring up in the area, as well as the local Cairns industry, and providing them a location and an opportunity to develop their own productions outside of the main production hub. So in terms of the specifics of the best practice for this case study, part of the focus was on Screen Queensland studios attending or really considering the needs for what these studios need to be. And that is both in terms of providing an affordable option for the local industry and smaller or mid-size productions in comparison to the big tentpole superhero films that have also been produced in Queensland, that the studio needs are very different for those different types of productions. So both the Brisbane and the Cairns studios are conversion facilities that were produced for relatively low cost, so about 12 million respectively, 12 million and 12.6 million respectively for the two. And they were both, in terms of, they were repurposed from existing facilities. So Brisbane were cotton sheds, and the Cairns studio was formerly a big box hardware store. And then as a result of this, the Brisbane studio opened a handful of years ago now, I think off the top of my head, 2018 or 2019, and has attracted a number of productions, both domestic, Australian, and incoming productions. So most recently, Brisbane has hosted Boy Swallows Universe and Fear Below from Netflix, as well as Young Rock, the first season, and Joe vs. Carol, and in 2020, the feature film Love and Monsters. And Cairns only opened a handful of months ago, but a number of local companies have already set up offices on site, and the show will be hosting the up-and-coming reality series Aussie Shore. So the 2 key lessons to take away here. The first is that Screen Queensland, with these 2 studio spaces, have complemented the main facility studio facility in the state, which is Village Roadshow Studios, by developing smaller conversion studios geared towards local and independent sectors, and that these were both developed as smaller scale facilities in comparison to Village Roadshow Studios, but in response to industry demand. And it allows the industries in both Brisbane or Southeast Queensland and Cairns an opportunity to produce and to host increasingly large productions as needed. So, Leon, back across to you for film friendliness.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So, another obvious key area of best practice is film friendliness. And when we're talking about the sort of formal and informal elements of best practice, film friendliness definitely sits more in the informal arena. And I think this is very much about, when a production lands in your jurisdiction, the ways in which that production can function without friction, can undertake production work that it needs to without difficulty, without friction. And that can be easier said than done. I mean, I think the uniqueness of a screen production is the number of agencies or organizations it interfaces with during production. Everything from permitting processes to road closures to organizations right across a jurisdiction. And I think the key finding here is about building consensus. So for film offices, for film commissions, to really play an active role in helping those agencies, police or council planning or permit offices, to really understand that this is an activity that is providing a lot of economic and strategic value to the jurisdiction, and that rapid responses and flexibility are really critical for ensuring film friendliness and ensuring there's a strong reputation for a jurisdiction. And I think that also links to this finding around access and understanding. So making sure that if there's a film office or a film commission, that they can access the people who make those decisions, and they can get consensus from people who run those offices, basically. And that also links into, as I say, a whole range of different types of interfacing. So everything from immigration, customs, tax, employment regulations, for example, the hiring of day players or freelancers, that can have challenges in some markets. So it's all about developing understanding, building consensus about the need to ensure that productions have a seamless experience on the ground. And there's a lot of ways in which to do that. I mean, the day-to-day advocacy that film commissioners typically undertake is one, and also studies that we and other consultancies provide around economic impact and strategic impact can also help build that advocacy.
So we have the next case study on film friendliness, excuse me, which is Screen Auckland in New Zealand. And Screen Auckland came up as a case study, because of how well they work as that sort of center point in Auckland and in New Zealand, helping connect the various different moving parts of the industry to make as smooth a process as possible for all parties involved in production, both the production itself, but also any other organizations or departments that are maybe involved in various elements. And that they've really created a very holistic and efficient experience that benefits productions, that benefits the domestic market and the local communities. So some of the ways they did that, and this is very much a high level handful of points. There's a lot more information in the full case study in the report, but part of that is by providing really clear process requirements and industry tools. So for a production considering Auckland as a filming location, there's a huge amount of information both on their websites as well as if they reach out that can be provided to them. And then particularly important here is accessible contacts and support offerings. So it's clear who to contact for different questions about production in Auckland. But then that response rate is also really quick, really helpful and really knowledgeable, which is hugely important for productions trying to make these decisions. And then they've also, Screen Auckland have done really excellent work in terms of spotlighting other initiatives as part of this process. So making sure that the Screen Climate Action Initiative and the Cultural Connection Initiative are foregrounded in a lot of these discussions and that industry are aware of these. In terms of the impact of these interventions, there's been really meaningful engagement with the iwi and hapu, and apologies for my pronunciation, regarding making sure that any filming that's happening on or around culturally sensitive areas there's care is taken with it, that appropriate protocols are in place, that costs and timeframes are being communicated correctly and appropriately with enough time for action. By working with industry and council to create these actionable strategies and tools, productions have been able to expand quite quickly in Auckland and as a really strong industry. And that there is a really strong reputation as a film-friendly location for Auckland as a result of the various initiatives and activity that they've done over the last few years. So the two takeaways for Screen Auckland in terms of film friendliness, the first is around providing concise details of processes that are needed by production. This can be in the case of checklists or considerations or spotlighting location offerings and making it really clear, and that this streamlines highlights areas where maybe there need actions and considerations earlier in the process. And then by providing access to key industry partners and commission contacts from the outset, productions have confidence in the jurisdiction. And hopefully, I just got an unstable internet notification, so hopefully that came through. Okay, Leon, let me know if I freeze.
Yeah, I'll jump in if your internet falls over, Kaylee.
Thank you. So moving on to the next area, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'll refer to as DEI going forward. This was one of the new areas of research in 2024. We did have it in 2019, but it was part of the workforce and capacity section. And we felt that while there's a huge amount of connection and collaboration between workforce and DEI, that it's also an important enough area that it should have its own chapter, so that we could really go into detail about the key areas of best practice as well as ineffective practice, and any other considerations. So as with workforce, and as you can see here, DEI should be integrated into those strategies, workforce development strategies, as a key consideration, and that should be happening from the start rather than as something that's introduced halfway through a strategy or towards the end, in order to make sure that it is really it's most strategic and actually most beneficial to the various groups that you may be trying to target. And as with workforce development, there should be consideration about what you're wanting to get out of the initiative or the intervention, and making sure that you are taking that into consideration in the development, but then also looking at things like what data do you need to collect to make sure that you're achieving those goals. Data collection can be quite tricky with DEI. Depending on the location and the jurisdiction, there can be certain regulations and requirements around collecting DEI data that need to be taken into consideration. But any kind of database makes it much easier to make more informed decisions and adjustments to initiatives and interventions, and make sure that they are having actionable impacts for the communities that you're trying to engage with. And then one of the ones that I think is perhaps most important is community engagement. We've done a lot of workforce development projects at Olsberg SBI, and one of the things that comes up, especially regarding DEI, is that Screen isn't necessarily seen as a career path for a lot of people. And as a result, if you're not careful about engaging with community, so that may be with other workforce development organizations or local groups that are more connected to whichever group it is, community group it is you're trying to target, your workforce development initiative or intervention, as well-intentioned as it may be, may not reach the people that you're trying to reach. And so community, they can feed into the process, they can provide advice, they can provide perspectives, but they can also help you get the message out and make sure that your workforce project or any other DEI initiative is targeting the correct people. And then with an eye on time, I will focus next and move on, but authentic representation. And so this should be happening on and off screen, and is a huge motivator in improving DEI in an industry. So making sure that any stories being told about certain groups have those groups involved, whether that's as an advisor on the project, as key staff behind the camera, the writer, director, also on camera in terms of the cast that may be telling these stories and being involved in these productions. So then we have sustainability, another new area for us. And this is increasingly important, not only for the screen sector, but for everyone in a number of industries, but it's still relatively new, that it's quite uncharted water for a lot of people. And so I think what came out of our research for this is that there's really excellent work being done around sustainability in screen. But one of the key things that needs to be done to help ensure that it's being done across the sector and across the industry globally is for someone, whether that's a film office or a film commission, to play a very pivotal role connecting the different people locally so they understand what sustainability practices could be implemented or should be implemented, but also connecting industry and vendors so that people know where they can go if they're wanting to implement sustainable practices around waste management, around the use of energy efficient generators, whatever it may be. And by making those connections, you're helping to build the sustainability in that location to ensure that it is happening consistently, and ultimately you'll end up normalizing that shift. But that central role, similar to film friendliness of the film commission or film office, is really pivotal and critical here. And then I think the other points and related to that is around incentivizing change. So Leon mentioned uplifts in regards to incentives, and there are a few incentives globally that have included uplifts or provisions around sustainable practices, which is one excellent way to go around trying to incentivize this change. But it's also important that if that sort of requirement or regulation is being implemented, to make sure that there are suitable options for sustainable practices in that location. So making sure that there are vendors, that there are the various tech or equipment required, and that the film office or film commission is able to make those connections between industry and the local vendors. And of course, that this is all going to take time, but it's about building habits and building increased awareness about what sustainability is possible and what can be done, and what it can achieve. So I'll pass across to Leon for our final area on partner engagement.
Thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, and I'll run through this 7th area fairly quickly, so we've got time for any questions that you may have. But obviously, partner engagement is really key, alongside the other 6 areas. Really, it's the hallmark of a healthy sector that private companies and public partners or public agencies both understand the sort of economic, the strategic, and the cultural potential and impact of screen production. And this, in order to help that understanding, this is about the engagement of those partners and the provision of strong and robust evidence to help sort of facilitate that understanding of the sector's value. I think there's a few key points to pull out here. I think, identifying key partners is critical. So just as in the film friendliness slide, we were talking about the need to identify the right stakeholders and advocate for the value of being film friendly. I think partner engagement is a very similar point, identifying the key agencies that drive support for the sector and the key individuals in those agencies. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I think the engagement and messaging, I think the data or the evidence that different entities will be interested in will differ. Some will be very financially focused or economically focused. Others may be more focused on, on strategic value or things like soft power, which again, I'll come back to in a moment. And also, there's a lot of churn in this area, as we know, governments often change, ministers often change, and the ability for a screen office or a film commission or whoever it might be leading on this to be able to retell that story and to keep undertaking that process of re-engagement with stakeholders. And then finally, the issue of correcting erroneous or negative assumptions about our sector. I mean, it's a pretty unique position in that most partners know what film and television is. Pretty much all of them will be consumers of film and television, but actually how many of them will understand the economics of the sector or the way that film and television productions are financed and manufactured? And I think sometimes there's a lot of understanding about the sort of public facing element of the sector and the red carpet elements perhaps, but the need to correct the assumption that it's all about movie stars or it's all about glitz. It's about helping those partners understand on a deeper basis. And we've seen a lot of jurisdictions use set visits, for example, to take ministers to show them actually this is the scale of employment on a film production, and these are the types of jobs that are being delivered by these productions. So I think that's a really important thing to underline, the need to correct erroneous assumptions, and also the need to undertake storytelling in this area. The screen production has a very good story to tell to legislators about the unique value it can stimulate and deliver, and being able to tell that story that brings together economic impact and cultural impact and all these other strategic areas is something that the sector is definitely getting better at, but definitely needs to be done. And then moving to the next slide, I won't dwell too much on this, but in the report we break down what we mean by sort of key partners by type, and also thinking about the type of interaction that typically would be undertaken with partners of each type. So to use central government, for example, or central legislators, the need to evidence the economics, excuse me, the economics of the sector. So what the sector is delivering for the economy, whereas others might be, there might be a different message, thinking about the private sector and trying to get banks maybe to cash flow and incentive, or to play a more active role in the domestic scene. I think that's then about convincing and activating and drawing them into the sector. And then finally, I'm just going to end with a case study on South Korea, which everybody knows, K content has been a very significant global success story in recent years. And I think really underlines the benefits of ensuring the partners have a nuanced understanding of what our sector is able to achieve for a nation or for a jurisdiction. And obviously, South Korea has absolutely embraced the the potential of soft power and the ability of screen production and other forms of media to really drive national branding. And this is a real level of interest we see in other countries as well. You know, the rising realization that there's a lot of competition for global investment in all areas of an economy. But if a country can drive soft power and can attract the influence of, you know, can use the influence of film and television, it can really help with things like diplomatic relations, foreign direct investment, trade relationships. And Korea really is a standout example of a country that has done this. And we've seen a number of different methods used. I mean, obviously, there's the direct investment from the Korean government and through KOFIC and its Motion Picture Fund, supporting sort of original, innovative Korean storytelling. And we've seen a huge increase in the value of Korean content globally on the back of that. So a direct relationship between the Korean government's sort of policy focus in this area and, you know, absolute economic value on one side, but also the strategic benefits that Korea has had in, you know, in telling its story to the world, and capped, of course, by the Best Picture win for Parasite. So I think a very strong case study in terms of underlining value and underlining the potential of the screen sector to deliver for jurisdictions. So we're gonna end there. I'm aware that we've spoken a lot, and there's a lot of material in this study. So I would encourage you to download and dig into it yourself. And we've put our email addresses in the chat and on this final slide if you have any questions for us. But if you have any questions for us right now, please do raise your hand or add in the chat, and we'd be very happy to answer. And I see there is a question from Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, in the chat about partner engagement and soft power, and whether we've seen effective examples of how soft power can be assessed or measured. Kaylee, I'll kick off on this, but do jump in with any thoughts yourself on the measurement of soft power. I mean, you know, the slight challenge we have as a sector is that it does, you know, the screen sector does deliver a lot of value in areas like culture, soft power, national branding. They're not always the easiest areas to measure, which makes things interesting for sure. I mean, I think the one example that springs to my mind is in Ireland, where we undertook some work looking at the cultural dividend of Ireland's Section 481 incentive. And part of that work was about surveying international audiences to see what, you know, how Irish content had made them feel about Ireland, and whether it had changed perceptions or, you know, altered how they viewed the country based on the content they'd been seeing. So there was some definite strong evidence coming out of there. There are other sort of more experimental, I guess, research approaches where, you know, we've seen researchers try to link the value of screen productions to, you know, to things like savings for a healthcare service. So if audiences are watching a country's film and TV output, what does that equate to in terms of value, public value in terms of health benefits and things like that? But Kelly, do you have any examples of that we should mention?
No, I was thinking of the Ireland study as well, which I think we used a similar methodology in Australia a few years earlier, which wasn't just about soft power, but was looking at both that external view of Ireland, but also in addition to that survey that Leon mentioned, we also did a similar survey for people in Ireland about the role that Section 481 content played in their own impression of Ireland, and how they feel about the content being produced, which I think that balance is quite important.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. Just wondering if anyone else has any questions we can answer, or any more information we can give you.
I think Leon and Kaylee, you'd be open to doing a more of a deep dive with any organisation should they wish for that, correct? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Correct.
definitely. We're, you know, as we said, this is a completely public, free study, and you know, we're keen to support its use as much as we can. So if you have any, you know, key partners in your own territory that would be useful for us to present to and unpack some of the findings here, we'd be very willing to. So yeah, do get in touch if that's of interest.
Fantastic. Well, that might be all for the questions. Thanks, Stefan. Thank you so much, Leon and Kaylee, for being online to be able to present this to us today. And, you know, as mentioned, the contact details are in the chat, and you can reach them through our website and through their own website too. So have a wonderful morning or afternoon or evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again at some point soon. So take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you.